You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. This is a collection of essays by Rudolf Steiner that were introductions to Goethe's scientific writings. It's entitled Nature's Open Secret. This is Chapter 10, entitled Knowledge and Action in the Light of Goethe's Ideas. Number 1, Methodology. We have established the relationship between the world of ideas attained through scientific thinking and unmediated, given, in quotes, experience. We have become acquainted with the beginning and the end of a process, experience devoid of ideas, and a conception of reality filled with ideas. Between those two, however, lies human activity. Our task is to actively unfold the end out of the beginning. How we do that is our method. It goes without saying, of course, that how we conceive of the relationship between the beginning and the end of the scientific process will call for a particular method. On what do we base this method? Step-by-step scientific thinking must overcome the shadowy form of reality we have described as the immediately given, and raise it into the luminous clarity of the idea. In other words, our method will consist in repeatedly asking of every fact, how does it contribute to a unified world of ideas? What is its place in my conceptual image of the world? When I have understood this, and have recognized how a thing relates to my ideas, my cognitive need is satisfied. There remains only one potential source of dissatisfaction. When a thing appears that refuses to connect with the concepts I stand for, I feel the need to overcome the intellectual discomfort caused by anything about which I must say, I see that it is present, and when I encounter it, it confronts me as a question mark. Yet nowhere in the harmony of my ideas can I find a place for it. No matter how I twist and turn my conceptual system, the questions it raises within me remain unanswered. This suggests what we need when we consider an object. When I first approach it, the object faces me in isolation. My thought world strives toward the point where its concept lies. I cannot rest until what first confronted me as an isolated phenomenon appears as an integral part of my conceptual system. Then the isolation of the object dissolves and reappears in a larger context. It is now illuminated by the combined thoughts of all other objects. It now contributes to the whole, and I fully understand its meaning within this larger harmony. All this takes place within us whenever we thoughtfully approach an object of experience. All scientific progress depends on this becoming aware of the point where a phenomenon can be integrated into the harmony of the world of ideas. Let us not misunderstand this. It does not mean that every phenomenon should be explainable in terms of pre-existing concepts, as if the world of ideas were closed and everything new had to be understood in terms of an old concept already in our possession. As our world of ideas expands, we may come to a point that has never been thought by anyone. Indeed, the historical progress of science depends precisely on the emergence of new ideas. Every one of them is connected by 1,000 threads to all other possible thoughts. Each of these connections assumes its own form. In each case, the connection is different. And it is precisely this that is the scientific method, that we show the concept of a particular phenomenon in its connections with the rest of the world of ideas. We call this process the deduction or proof of the concept. Scientific thinking of any kind consists only in finding links between concepts, in allowing one concept to arise from another. The scientific method involves this shuttling back and forth between concepts. The reader may wonder whether I am describing just another version of the old story of the correspondence between the intelligible world and the sensory world. According to its tenets, if we are to believe that this shuttling back and forth between concepts can lead us to an accurate image of reality, we must assume that a correspondence exists between the objective world and our concepts. This, however, is an erroneous view of the relationship between individual objects and concepts. When I am first confronted by a particular object or phenomenon in the world of experience, I have no idea at all what it is. Only after I have penetrated it and its concept has become clear to me do I know what I am looking at. This does not imply that the particular object and the concept are two different things. No, they are the same thing. What presents itself to me in the particular object is nothing but the concept itself. The reason I see this object as separate and cut off from the rest of reality is that I have not yet perceived it in its essence, that it has not yet presented itself to me as it is. This consideration allows us to specify further the nature of the scientific method. Each individual object represents a particular content in the system of thought. It is rooted in the totality of the world of ideas and can be understood only in relation to this totality. Thus, every object necessarily presents our thinking with a double task. First, we must establish firmly the contours of the corresponding thought. And second, we must establish all the threads that lead from this thought to the whole idea world. Reality demands clarity in the individual details and depth in the whole. One is the task of the intellect, the other the task of reason. The intellect creates thought forms for individual aspects of reality. The more precisely it delineates them, the more sharply it draws the contours, the more faithfully it does its work. Reason, then, assigns these thoughts their places in the harmony of the world of ideas. This assumes, of course, that this unity already resides in the content of the thoughts created by the intellect, that one life pervades the content of all our thoughts, while the intellect artificially keeps them separated. Reason overcomes the separation without losing the clarity. The intellect leads us away from reality, and reason brings us back to it. This can be represented graphically, and there's a picture. All parts are connected in the overall composition. The same principle is at work in all the parts. The intellect separates the individual forms because in the given outer world we encounter them separately, and he says, and indicated by the solid lines, and reason connects their unity, indicated by the dotted lines. If we assume two experiences, one, the sun shining down, and two, a warm stone, our intellect holds the two apart, because they present themselves as two phenomena. One is thought of as the cause, the other as the effect. Then reason steps in, breaks down the partition, and sees the unity in the duality. All concepts created by the intellect, cause and effect, substance and property, body and soul, idea and reality, God and world, and so on, are merely ways of artificially holding apart what is a unified reality. The role of reason, on the other hand, is to look for the inner unity in the multiplicity without erasing the content created or mystically obscuring the clarity of the intellect. In this way we are returned to the unitary reality from which the intellect had distanced us. A more precise nomenclature would term concepts products of the intellect and ideas the creations of reason. Now we can see that the path of science leads to ideas through concepts. This consideration offers a clear distinction between the subjective and the objective elements of knowing. it is clear that our division of reality is purely subjective and created by our intellect. I can divide the same objective unity into individual thoughts that are different from those of others. Through its connections, however, reason can restore the objective unity from which we departed. The unified image of reality, and there's some figures drawn, can be broken down for the sake of understanding it. I may divide it one way and someone else another way. Our reason pulls it together, and we return to the same unified image. This helps us understand why human beings have so many different concepts and diverse views of reality, even though reality must remain the same. The differences reside in the differences between our intellectual approaches. This sheds light on the development of various scientific points of view and helps us understand the origin of the multiplicity of philosophical worldviews, none of which need to be certified as the truth. In considering the multiplicity of human concepts, the question is not merely whether the concepts are true or false. We will always try to understand how a particular thinker's intellectual world arises from the world's harmony. We will try to understand rather than denounce as error those opinions that happen to disagree with our own. This difference in scientific viewpoints is related to the fact that each person has a different realm of experience. Each of us encounters only a small part of the whole reality. Each person's intellect processes this part, and it is this example that mediates the way to ideas. Thus, even though we may all be cognizant of the same idea, it is always in different realms. Only the final result can be the same. The paths leading to it may be different. The individual judgments and concepts that constitute our knowledge do not have to agree. It is important, however, that those judgments and concepts eventually lead us to swim in the flowing stream of ideas. When all is said and done, all human beings meet in this stream, when active thinking takes them beyond their separate points of view. Limited experience or an unproductive mind may, of course, lead to one-sided, incomplete views. But even the most limited experience must finally lead us to the realm of ideas. For we rise to this realm not through the breadth of our experience, but through our inherent capacities as human beings. Limited experience merely results in a one-sided expression of the realm of ideas. It limits our means to bring forth the light shining within us, but it cannot prevent us completely from letting this light arise within us. Whether our scientific or general views are exhaustive is not at all a matter of their spiritual depth. Returning to Goethe, many of his statements will be seen as following from the thoughts described in this chapter. And I might add that I find this the only right relationship between author and commentator. Thus Goethe writes, quote, "If I know my relationship to myself and to the outer world, I call it truth. And thus each person can have his or her own truth, and still it is always the same." Close quote from Verses in Prose. This can be understood only on the basis of the foregoing considerations. End of Part 1. This is Part 2 of Chapter 10, entitled Dogmatic and Inherent Method. A scientific judgment is formed either by connecting two concepts or by connecting a percept and a concept. The judgment, quote, "no effect without a cause," close quote, is of the former kind. Quote, "the tulip is a plant," close quote, is an example of the latter. In daily life, there are also situations when we connect one percept with another. For example, quote, "the rose is red," close quote. Whenever we pass a judgment, we do so on a certain basis. Now, there are two ways of looking at the basis for a judgment. According to the first school of thought, we assume that the objective basis for the truth of a judgment lies beyond the evidence provided by the concepts and percepts that contributed to the judgment. In this view, the basis for the truth of a judgment does not necessarily coincide with the subjective basis that led to the judgment. The logical basis, in this view, should not be confused with the objective basis. Whereas this school of thought may suggest a way to reach the objective foundations of our insights, the means attributed to our cognizing mind are insufficient for the purpose. The objective reality underlying my claims lies within a world unknown to me. The claim itself, altogether with its formal basis, parenthesis, inner consistency, the support of various axioms, and so on, close parenthesis, is the only aspect within my knowledge. Any kind of science based on this kind of view is dogmatic. Theological philosophy based on revelation is an example of dogmatic science, as is contemporary science. Just as there is a dogma of revelation, there is also a dogma of experience. The dogma of revelation transmits truths about matters completely removed from the human perspective. The human being does not know the world about which ready-made articles of faith are prescribed. We can never find the grounds upon which our beliefs rest. It is impossible to ever know why something is true. What can be attained is a belief, not knowledge. But the claims of experimental science are mere dogmas as well, insofar as it asserts that we should limit ourselves to pure experience, merely observing, describing, and systematizing its changes, never rising to the conditions which are not yet given in the immediate experience. In this case also, truth is not attained through insight into the object, but is imposed upon us from outside. I see what happens and what is there, and I register it. The reason why this is the way it is considered to lie within the object. I see the consequences, never the cause. At one time, science was dominated by the dogma of revelation. Now, it is dominated by the dogma of experience. In the past, thinking about the causes of revealed truth was considered presumptuous. Today it is considered impossible to know anything other than what the facts express. The question of why the facts speak in this way and not in another is considered beyond the purview of experience and therefore unanswerable. Footnote: higher organizational principles, the metamorphosis of plants and animals, or the essential nature of a particular species, cannot be grasped through an intellectual analysis of sensory experience. We apprehend such principles only through what Goethe calls reason. Compare Steiner's distinction of intellect and reason, pages 110 forward, editor, end of footnote. We have shown that beyond recognizing the truth of a judgment, it makes no sense to presume why the statement is true. When we push through to the point where the essence of a thing arises in us as idea, we come to see the idea as entirely self-contained, self-supporting, and self-sustaining, requiring no further external explanation. We can come to rest in it. Given the necessary capacities, we can recognize that the idea contains in itself all its constituent parts, that we have in it all we could ever ask for. The whole ground of being has emerged in the idea, has poured itself into it without any reservation, and we need not look any further. We do not find in the idea an image of what we are looking for in things. Rather, we find what we are looking for itself. To the extent that the parts of our idea world flow together in our judgments, this result is achieved by their own content and not through any external reasons. In our thinking, the concrete grounds for our statements are immediately present, not just their formal grounds. We, therefore, reject the view that beyond all ideas there is an absolute reality that sustains all things, including thinking itself. That worldview is completely unable to find the grounds of existence in the attainable world. For this view, the ultimate cause of existence has not entered the world as it is manifested to us. It is rather a being for itself and separate from the present world. This view, which can be called realism, takes two forms. Either it postulates a multiplicity of real beings underlying the world, parenthesis Leibniz, Herbart, close parenthesis, or it assumes a unified reality, Schopenhauer. This reality cannot be known to be identical with the idea in either case. Its very nature is presumed to be fundamentally different. It is impossible to be a realist once the question of the essential nature of phenomena fully enters our consciousness. For what is the purpose in asking about the essential nature of the world? It really comes down to my seeing a thing and a voice within me telling me that ultimately it is really much more than what I see before me. In fact, however, even as I look at the thing, this greater reality is already actively trying to manifest within me. If I look for explanations, it is only because the world of ideas, active within me, demands my explanation of the surrounding world. A being in whom ideas do not arise would not be motivated to explain things more deeply. Such a being would be fully satisfied with sensory appearances. The drive to explain the world arises when our thinking urges us to unite the idea content available to it with the world of appearances, and to penetrate all things in a conceptual way, to make what we see, hear, and so on into things we understand. If we give these matters our most serious consideration, it is impossible to be an adherent of realism as we have described it. Any attempt to explain the world through some reality that is not an idea is a self-contradiction, and it is difficult to understand how that notion gained any followers at all. We cannot have a need, nor is it even possible, to explain perceptible reality through something not found in thinking itself, let alone something fundamentally different from thinking. For one thing, what would motivate us to explain the world in terms of something completely alien to us, even hidden from us? Assuming we were to encounter this hidden agent, we would have to ask, in what form and where? It cannot be found in thinking. If not in thinking, should we expect to find it in some outer or inner perception? But what purpose can it possibly serve to explain the world of sensations through something of the same nature? We are left with a third possibility, the assumption that we are able to reach an unthinkable yet very real world by means other than thinking or perception. This assumption leads us directly to mysticism. We do not need to concern ourselves here with this, because we are interested only in the relationship between thinking and being, idea and reality. Let the mystic write the epistemology of mysticism. It was the matured Schelling's view that our reason can only develop what the world content is, but can never attain the fact that it exists in the first place. To us, this seems most absurd. For us, the existence of a thing is the precondition for what it is. And we would have no way of attaining the what of a thing unless we had established that it exists in the first place. According to our reason, the fact that a thing exists is a part of the very fact that I grasp its meaning. Schelling assumed that it is possible to experience a positive meaning of the world without even being convinced that it exists. This, and his conviction that we can know of existence only through higher experience, seems inconceivable to self-reflective thinking. We are led to assume that in his later years, Schelling could no longer understand his earlier views, which had such an impact on Goethe. It is not permissible to presume higher forms of being than those accessible to the world of ideas. People look for yet another reality only because they are often unable to grasp that the being of an idea is much nobler and fuller than is perceived reality. If we are dissatisfied with ideas, it is because we consider them to be insubstantial fabrications of the mind, empty of any concrete reality. It is because we are, in fact, unable to grasp the positive nature of ideas. We think of them as mere abstractions and have no experience of their fullness, perfection, and soundness. We need to lift ourselves through culture and self-development to a higher perspective, from which we can apprehend the concrete reality of a being that is invisible to the eye and unavailable to the hand's touch, and which only reason can encompass. In other words, we are establishing an idealism that is at the same time realism. By this we mean that thinking yearns to understand reality through ideas. This yearning is hidden in the question, what is the essence of reality? The answer to this question emerges only at the end of the scientific process. We do not proceed as do the realists who postulate a true reality from which they derive the world of their experience. We distinguish ourselves from the realists through our full awareness of the fact that ideas are the only means we have to explain the world. Realists also have only this means, but they do not realize it. Realists derive their world from ideas, while convinced they are deriving it from another reality. Leibniz's world of monads is nothing but a world of ideas. But Leibniz believes he has gotten hold of a reality more fundamental than the world of ideas. All realists make the same mistake. They contrive realities, never realizing that they remain in the realm of ideas. We reject this realism because it deceives itself about the fact that ideas are actually the foundation of its world conception. We reject with equal firmness the false idealism that believes we cannot transcend our consciousness because we never escape the world of ideas, and thus all our conceptions and the whole world itself are a subjective illusion, a dream of our consciousness, Fichte. Such idealists fail to understand that while we cannot get beyond the world of ideas, they are themselves an objective reality, whose foundation lies in itself and not in the subject. They forget that although we cannot escape the universal nature of thinking, rational thinking takes us right into the heart of objectivity. Realists fail to understand that the objective is the idea. Idealists fail to understand that the idea is objective. We still need to consider the empiricists, who maintain that all attempts to explain reality through ideas are indefensible philosophical deductions. They assert that we should limit ourselves to what is immediately accessible through our senses. Our response to this viewpoint is simply that its requirements can only be methodological and formal in nature. If we must stop with the given, it can mean only one thing: that we must appropriate the things that come to meet us. What comes to meet us, however, cannot be predetermined by this viewpoint, because that what would first have to be found in the given itself. It is hard to conceive how one could argue for pure experience and simultaneously demand that one remain within the limits of the sensory world, because ideas can also meet the criteria of being given. Positivism is forced to leave unanswered the question of what is given, and is thus easily compatible with idealistic results of research. In this case, the demands of empiricism coincide with our own. We unite all points of view in ours inasmuch as they are justified. Our viewpoint is idealism, because it finds the foundations of the world in ideas. It is realism, because it treats the idea as concrete reality. And it is positivism or empiricism to the extent that it works toward the content of ideas as given, rather than by means of a priori constructs. Ours is an empirical method that penetrates to the real and ultimately finds satisfaction in ideal results. It is inadmissible, in our view, to conclude on the basis of what is given or known the existence of something not given that underlies and determines it. We reject any conclusion in which one of the elements is not given. Drawing a conclusion is no more than moving logically from given elements to other equally given ones. In the end, we link A to B by way of C, but each of these must be given. When Folkelt says that thinking forces us to assume realities other than the given and to transcend it, we say that what we wish to add to the immediately given is already active in our thinking. We reject all metaphysics, which consists in explaining the given through a non-given, or something postulated, parenthesis, Wolf, Herbart, close parenthesis. To us, a conclusion is merely a formal act. It leads not to something new, but makes connections among elements that are actually present. The end of section 2. This is section 3 of chapter 10, entitled The System of Science. What form does a fully developed science take in the light of Goethe's way of thinking? First of all, we must be clear about the fact that the entire content of science is a given, partly given externally from the sensory world, partly from within, from the world of ideas. All our scientific activity involves overcoming the particular form in which this entire content of the given presents itself and giving it a satisfying form. This is necessary because the inner unity of the given is hidden from us when we first encounter it, and only its surface appears to us. The method that will establish these unifying relationships differs according to the phenomenal field in which we are active. Let us first consider a realm in which we are dealing with a multitude of sensory elements, related in varying ways. As we begin to contemplate these elements with our thinking, their interrelationships become clear to us. One element or another may appear conditioned to some degree by the others in a particular way. The conditions determining one become clear as we consider the others. We derive one manifestation from another. The manifestation of the warm stone, for example, can be derived as the effect of the warming sun rays, which are consequently seen as the cause. What we perceive in one thing is explained when we derive it from another perceptible thing. We see how ideal laws appear in this realm. They encompass the sensory events and stand above them. They determine the lawful response of one thing insofar as it is determined by another. Our task here is to assemble a series of phenomena in such a way that their necessary connections become evident, so that we can see them function as a thoroughly lawful whole. The realm that can be explained in this way is in organic nature. But in our experience, things do not appear to us in such a way that the nearest in time or space is always the nearest in terms of its inner nature. We must progress from what is nearest in time and space to what is nearest conceptually. We must look for phenomena that are immediately adjacent in the conceptual realm. We must endeavor to assemble a series of facts that complement and mutually support one another. In this way, we arrive at a group of interacting, sense-perceptible elements. The phenomenon unfolding before our eyes follows, in a transparent way, from the factors involved. Following Goethe, we will call such a phenomenon an archetypal phenomenon, or fundamental fact. This archetypal phenomenon is identical with objective natural law. On the one hand, the connections we are describing can be established mentally, as when I think, for example, of factors that affect a stone when thrown horizontally. First, the kinetic force. Second, the Earth's gravitational force. Third, air resistance. I can then derive the trajectory of the stone from these factors. Alternately, I can physically bring together the individual factors and wait for the resulting phenomena. This is what we do when we make an experiment, whereas a natural phenomenon may be baffling to us because we know the effects or manifestations, but not the causes or necessary conditions. The phenomenon produced by an experiment is clear, because we assembled the causal factors ourselves. This is the path of scientific research. We begin with experience to see what is actually involved. We then continue through observation to determine why it actually is so. And then we proceed to the culminating experiment to see how the lawful relationships involved actually express themselves. Unfortunately, we seem to have lost the essay from Goethe that best supports these views. It came after his essay titled The Experiment of Mediator Between Subject and Object. Beginning with this essay, we will attempt to reconstruct the presumed content of the lost essay from the only source available to us, the correspondence between Goethe and Schiller. The essay, titled Experiment as Mediator Between Subject and Object, arose from the studies that Goethe conducted to justify his research on optics. The essay then was left lying until, in 1798, the poet resumed the study with renewed vigor and, together with Schiller, began a thorough and scientifically serious investigation of the fundamental principles of the natural scientific method. On January 10, 1798, Goethe sent Schiller the essay mentioned for comments, and on January 13th he wrote to his friend that he was willing to expand on the views presented in it in a new essay. He went to work on it, and on January 17, a short essay was sent to Schiller, outlining one of the characteristics of the scientific method. This essay is not included in the catalogue of his works. It would certainly be invaluable for a full appreciation of Goethe's basic views on scientific methodology. We can, however, find the thoughts presented there in Schiller's detailed letter of January 19, 1798. What this letter indicates is confirmed and complemented by Goethe's title, Verses in Prose. Footnote. Parenthesis later, Steiner added this footnote, close parenthesis. In my introduction on page 38 of volume 34 of Goethe's complete works, I say that unfortunately we seem to have lost the essay from Goethe that best supports his thoughts on experience, experiments, and scientific knowledge. It has not been lost, however, but found its way into the Goethe archive in the form mentioned here. The essay is dated January 15, 1798, and was sent to Schiller on the 17th. It is the continuation of the essay titled The Experiment as Mediator Between Subject and Object. I took the thoughts expressed in the essay from the correspondence and presented them in the introduction on page 39 in exactly the same way it is now available. In terms of content, the essay adds nothing to what I wrote there. Indeed, the insights into Goethe's method and mode of knowledge gained through my study of his other writings are confirmed in every point. Rudolf Steiner. The page numbers I mentioned are in fact Roman numerals. End of footnote. Goethe distinguishes three methods of scientific research. These in turn rest on three different approaches to the phenomena. The first method is common empiricism, which does not go beyond the empirical phenomena or immediate facts. It is absorbed by individual appearances. If common empiricism is to be of consequence, it must limit its activity to detailed descriptions of the phenomena it encounters. That is, it takes an empirical inventory. Science, in the empiricist's view, would be nothing but a sum of individual factual descriptions. In contrast to empiricism, rationalism represents the next step. It strives to establish scientific phenomena. Not limiting itself to the mere description of the phenomena, it attempts to explain them by discovering causes, formulating hypotheses, and so on. This is the step where the intellect, departing from the phenomena, goes on to draw conclusions about their causes and connections. Goethe considered both of these stances one-sided. Common empiricism is crude and unscientific, because it never escapes the mere recitation of chance occurrences. Rationalism, on the other hand, interprets into the phenomenal world causes and connections that are not contained within it. Common empiricism is unable to rise from the fullness of the world of facts to free thinking, and rationalism loses the phenomena as the solid factual ground under its feet, succumbing to the power of wishful thinking and subjective fancy. Goethe forcefully condemns the passion for rushing from observations to conclusions. Thus he says in his verses in prose, quote, "It is a bad thing, and one often encountered, to immediately tie a conclusion to an observation, and then give both equal weight. Theories are usually the hasty product of an impatient intellect that would like to be rid of the phenomena and eagerly replaces them with images, concepts, or sometimes only words. One suspects, one even clearly sees, that it is just a makeshift. But do not passion and partisanship always love a makeshift? And rightly so, because they need them so much." End of quote. Goethe is especially hard on the misuse of causal reasoning. Rationalism, in its unbridled fantasy, continually looks for causality where the facts do not warrant it. In verses in prose, he states, quote, "The most innate and most important concept, that of cause and effect, is used in ways that lead to countless, endlessly repeated errors." Close quote. The mania for simplistic connections in particular leads one to think of phenomena as links in a chain of causes and effects, following one another in a strict linear fashion. In truth, however, any phenomenon that is conditioned by an earlier one is at the same time dependent on many other influences. In this case, the length of nature is taken into consideration, but not its breadth. According to Goethe, both paths, that of common empiricism and that of rationalism, are intermediate stages on the way to the highest scientific method, but only stages that must be transcended. This is achieved by rational empiricism, which deals with pure phenomena that are identical with objective natural laws. Common empiricism, unmediated experience, gives us only disconnected individual facts, an aggregate of outer appearances. It gives them to us not as the conclusion of a scientific process, but as its initial experience. Science requires us to look for connections and view individual facts as interconnected. In this sense, there seems to be a separation between the need to conceptualize and the given facts. For the cognizing spirit, there are only relationships. In nature, there is only separation. The spirit strives for the species or type. Nature creates only individuals. We escape this contradiction by reflecting on the fact that, on the one hand, the connecting power of the spirit is without content, and therefore cannot in itself grasp anything concrete. and that, on the other hand, the separation of natural objects is not a matter of their essence, but of their manifestation in space. Indeed, when we get to the essence of the individual, our attention is drawn to the species or type. Because natural objects manifest as separate, we need the synthesizing power of the Spirit to show us their inner unity. And because the unity of reason is itself empty, it needs natural objects to fill it. Thus, in the third stage, phenomena and spiritual capacities meet and become one. Only now is the Spirit fully satisfied. There is another area of research in which the manifestation of an individual fact does not appear as the consequence of another discrete fact. Thus we cannot understand it by calling on the aid of another similar fact. Here a series of sense-perceptible elements appear as a direct expression of a unifying principle. If we wish to understand the individual fact at all, we need to penetrate to this principle. We cannot explain the phenomenon as the result of outer effects, but must develop it from the inside outward. What had played a determining role is now merely an influence or stimulus. In the inorganic realm discussed earlier, beginning on page 118, I could understand everything if I could see a fact as the effect of other facts, that is, deduce it from external conditions. But now I am being forced to ask different questions. If I know the external influences, I still have no certainty as to exactly how the phenomenon will respond. I must derive the response from the central principle of the phenomenon affected by the external influence. I cannot say what effect this external influence will have, but only that the inner principle of the phenomenon responds in a certain way to a particular external influence. Anything that happens is the consequence of an inner lawfulness. What I need to comprehend, therefore, is this inner lawfulness. My research must discover what shapes itself from the inside out. The type is the self-structuring principle at the foundation of every phenomenon in this realm, and I must look for it in each one. We are now in the realm of organic nature. What we term archetypal phenomena in relation to inorganic nature is the type in organic nature. The type is a general image or idea of the organism, the animality in the animal. Because of their significant relevance to our consideration of the type, we have reiterated the main points discussed earlier in chapter 4. In the ethical and historical sciences, however, we are concerned with ideas in a narrower sense. As sciences, ethics and history are driven by ideas, which are the reality they investigate. The task of each science is to work through the given material far enough to reach the archetype, the type, or in the case of history, the guiding idea. Quote, once physicists have come to understand what we have called the archetypal phenomenon, they are safe, and philosophers with them. They become convinced that they have arrived at the frontier of their science, and have come to an empirical high point, from which they can look back down and survey all the stages of experience, and from which they can also look forward into, if not enter, the realm of theory. The philosophers are also safe, because they take the physicists' results and make it the starting point of their own work, from Theory of Color by Goethe, end of quote. This is where the work of philosophers truly begins. They take the archetypal phenomena and bring them into a satisfying inner relationship. We see now, from Goethe's point of view, what must replace metaphysics: observation guided by ideas, the combination and derivation of the archetypal phenomena. Goethe speaks repeatedly in this way about the relationship between empirical science and philosophy, and with particular clarity in his letters to Hegel. In the title Annals, he speaks again and again of a schema of natural science. If this were to be found, we would be able to see how he conceived of the relationships among individual archetypal phenomena and how he assembled them in a lawful sequence. We can get an idea of this for ourselves by looking at his list of the various kinds of effects. And there's a list, and they are accidental, mechanical, physical, chemical, organic, psychic, ethical, religious, and the last is arising from genius. This hierarchical list can help us to order the archetypal phenomena. Footnote, this list was published in Volume 4, Section 2, page 294 of the edition of Goethe's Scientific Works, edited by Steiner, editor and a footnote. Part 4 of Chapter 10, entitled On the Limits of Knowledge and the Formation of Hypotheses. People talk a great deal these days about the limits of knowledge. It is said that our ability to explain existing reality can reach only so far, at which point we must stop. We believe that this question cannot be answered correctly unless it is asked correctly. By asking the right questions, we can often dispense with a whole army of errors. If we consider the fact that the object to be explained is a given, it should become clear that the given itself cannot limit us in any way. Before it can demand explanation or understanding, it must present itself to us within the world of given reality. Whatever remains outside the realm of the given does not need explaining. Any limit would arise only when, confronted by a given reality, we lacked the means to examine it. Our need to explain arises precisely because the way we wish to define the given, the explanation we wish to give to it, appears on the horizon of what our thinking presents to us. It is not that the explanation, the essence of the thing to be explained, is unknown to us. Far from it. It is its emergence in our mind that requires the explanation. The thing that demands the explanation and our means to explain it are both available to us. We only need to establish the connection between the two. The explanation is not a quest for an unknown, but a clarification of the interrelationship between two knowns. It should never occur to us to explain a given in terms of something that we do not already know. In principle, this means that there can be no limits to explanation. Having said this, one thing does give a semblance of justification to the theory that there is a limit to knowledge. It may happen that we have an inkling that some external reality exists, but that it is removed from our field of perception. We perceive its traces, its effects, and we presume that it exists. In this sense, we can speak of a limit of knowledge. The unattainable in this case, however, is not of such a kind that it will provide principles of explanation. It is rather something perceptible, but not yet perceived. Such obstacles to my perception do not constitute a fundamental limit to knowledge, but are accidental and external, and may be surmounted. Something I only suspect today may become a complete experience tomorrow. A principle, however, knows no external obstacles, which are usually spatial or temporal. It is given to me inwardly. Unless I observe it myself, I cannot assume its existence through my knowledge of other things. This is where the theory of hypotheses comes in. An hypothesis is an assumption whose truth we do not know directly, but only through its consequences. We see a series of manifestations that is explained only when we assume an underlying factor that cannot be experienced directly. Can such a hypothesis extend to the assumption of a principle? Obviously not, because it would be a contradiction to assume an inner principle without experiencing it. An hypothesis can assume only what I do not perceive yet, but would if I removed external obstacles. An hypothesis can indeed assume something not perceived, but it must assume something that potentially can be perceived. Thus, we must be able to verify every hypothesis through future experience. An hypothesis is justified only when it has the potential to go beyond being hypothetical. Hypotheses about central scientific principles have no value. When a thing cannot be explained through a known, concrete principle, it is not explicable, nor does it call for an explanation. Part 5 of Chapter 10, entitled Ethical and Historical Sciences. We have gained some clarity about our relationship to the world by answering the question, what is knowing? The view we have developed in dealing with this question is certain to shed light on the value and significance of human actions as well. The way we conceive of our role as human beings will determine the significance we attach to our achievements in the world. Our first task will be to investigate the nature of human activity. How do the effects of human actions compare with the effects of other events within the universal process? Let us consider two things, a product of nature and a human creation. For example, a crystal and a wagon wheel. Both objects appear to us as the results of laws that can be expressed as concepts. The only difference is that the crystal must be considered to be the immediate product of the natural laws that determine it. Whereas in the case of the wagon wheel, the human being intervenes between the concept, laws, and the object. What we think of as underlying the reality of the natural object is introduced into reality through human activity. Through the act of knowing, we experience the principles that determine sensory experience. Our thoughts reveal the world of ideas that already lie within reality. We complete the world process by invoking the agent who continually generates products, yet would remain forever hidden within them, if not for our thinking. Through our activities, however, we complement this process by introducing the unrealized world of ideas into reality. We have come to realize that ideas are the foundation of all existence, its determining condition, and nature's intention. Our knowing leads us to the point where we can apprehend the tendency of the world process, the intention of creation, in the indications contained in our natural environment. Having done that, we are called upon in our actions to work as individuals toward the realization of that intention. Consequently, our actions appear as the direct culmination of the kind of productivity that fills all nature. They flow directly from the world's foundations. And yet how different our actions are from that other natural activity. The products of nature do not by any means carry within themselves the ideal lawfulness that seems to govern them. They call for a meeting with something higher, human thinking. The governing principle that appears to this thinking. It is different for human activity, in which the idea dwells directly within the active object, that is, in the human being. And if a higher being were to meet it, this being would find in our activity only what we ourselves have put there. A perfect human action is the result of our own intentions and nothing else. When we see one natural product influencing another, we see an effect. That effect is determined by laws that can be expressed as concepts. But to understand the effect, It is not enough to connect it with one law or another. We must have a second perceptible thing, which we must also be able to resolve completely into concepts. If we observe a depression in the ground, we look for the object that made it. This leads us to the concept of an agent that is active when the cause of a phenomenon appears as another external perception, that is, to the concept of a force. We encounter force only when an idea first appears in an object of perception and in that form affects another object. In contrast to this, there are instances when such mediation falls away and the idea approaches the sensory world directly. In these situations, the idea itself appears as the causal agent. It is here that we speak of will. Will is the idea itself, apprehended as force. It is completely inadmissible to speak of will as an independent agency. When a human being performs an action, we cannot say that will is added to the idea. Whoever speaks in this way has not come to a clear understanding of the concepts involved. After all, what is the human personality if we regard the world of ideas that fills it? It is active existence, of course. To conceive of it otherwise, as a dead, inert product of nature, would be to place it on the level of a lifeless stone. This active existence is an abstraction, however, not concrete reality. It cannot be grasped and is without substance. If we try to grasp it and give it content, we are simply returned to the world of ideas, engaged in activity. Edward von Hartmann makes this abstraction into a second world-constituting principle, next to the idea. But it is nothing but the idea itself, in a form of manifestation. Will without idea would be nothing. This cannot be said of the idea, because activity is one of its elements, whereas the idea is its own self-sustaining being. Now let us consider another characteristic of human activity that follows with necessity from what has been said. When we explain a natural event, we trace it back to its conditions. We try to discover the, in quotes, producer of the given product. When I observe an effect, it is not enough to look for its cause. These two perceptions alone do not satisfy my need for an explanation. Rather, I must return to the laws according to which this particular cause has this particular effect. With human actions, this is different. Here, the determining lawfulness itself takes action. The causal agent that forms the product appears on the scene. In the case of this manifesting entity, we do not need to look any further for underlying determining factors. When we know the idea that is embodied in a work of art, we understand the work. We do not need to look for any further lawful connections between the idea, cause, and work, effect. We understand the actions of a political leader if we know the intentions, ideas, behind them. We need not inquire any further. We may, therefore, distinguish between natural processes and human actions. In natural processes, the law is the underlying determining factor behind what comes into manifest existence, whereas in human actions, existence itself becomes the law and is determined solely by itself. Consequently, in every natural process, we can distinguish between what determines and what is determined. What is determined follows with necessity from the determining factor. But human actions are determined only by themselves. This is freedom of action. When the intentions of nature, which exist behind appearances and determine them, enter the human being, they themselves manifest but as appearances, they are not determined by hidden causes. If all the processes of nature are manifestations of the idea, then human activity is the idea itself in action. In our theory of knowledge, we concluded that our consciousness is not merely a means to form an image of the world foundation, but that this fundamental lawfulness itself manifests in its most primal form in our thinking. Consequently, we will see the unconditioned activity of this primal lawfulness in human actions as well. We do not need a world guide to give our actions purpose and direction. The world guide has renounced his power and handed everything over to human beings. He has relinquished separate existence and assigned us the task of continuing the work. We find ourselves in the world. We observe nature, and we recognize in it the indications of something deeper, of hidden laws and intentions. Our thinking allows us to recognize those intentions which become our spiritual possessions. Having penetrated to the world's foundation, we now take action toward realizing its intentions. Thus, the philosophy presented here is a true philosophy of freedom. In the realm of human activity, it acknowledges neither natural necessity nor the influence of an external creator or world guide, because in either case the human being would not be free. If natural necessity were functioning in ourselves as it does in other things, we would act under compulsion. To understand such actions, we would have to look for external factors that determine them, and freedom would be out of the question. Of course, we are not excluding the fact that there are innumerable human activities that fall into this category, but here we are not considering those. Human beings, to the extent that they are beings of nature, may also be understood in terms of natural laws that govern natural processes. But considering human existence strictly from the perspective of natural laws does not account for our activity as knowing or truly ethical beings. That is the point where we actually step beyond the realm of natural events. What has been established here holds true for our highest potential, which is more an ideal than a reality. The course of human life involves our evolution from a being of nature to one such as we have described. It is our task to liberate ourselves from all natural laws and to give ourselves our own laws. We must also reject the influence of an otherworldly guide of human destinies. Once we assume the existence of such a guide, we can no longer speak of true freedom. Such a power determines and directs the activities of human beings, who must then do as directed. Thus, we no longer experience the motivation of our actions as the ideal we have set for ourselves, but as a commandment of that power. Again, our actions are determined rather than free. We would not feel free of external compulsion, but dependent, mere intermediaries, for the intent of a higher power. Dogmatism, as we have seen, involves trying to discover why something is true by looking for an agent outside our subjective consciousness and inaccessible to it. Our view, on the other hand, confirms the truth of a judgment because its reasons lie in the concepts that are contained in our consciousness and that flow into the judgment. Those who conceive of a world foundation beyond the compass of our ideas must believe that the reason we recognize something as true is different from the objective reason for its truth. Truth is thus conceived as dogma. A commandment in the realm of ethics is the same as dogma in the realm of science. Those who base their actions on commandments act according to laws that they have not formulated. They look for externally prescribed norms for their actions and act out of duty. This is the only context in which it makes sense to speak of duty. When we experience the motive as external, we bow to necessity and follow it, acting out of duty. Our theory of knowledge cannot accept the validity of this kind of action, where human nature has reached moral maturity. We recognize the infinite perfection of the world of ideas. We know that the impulses for our actions emanate from this world within us, and that consequently the only ethical actions are those that emanate directly from their corresponding ideas within us. According to this viewpoint, we perform an action only because we feel an inner need for its realization. We act because our own volition motivates us, not an external power. Once we have formed a concept of it, the object of our action fills us inwardly so that we actively strive to carry it out. The only motive for our actions should be the urge to realize an idea, the drive to achieve a purpose. Whatever impels us to act should first unfold its life within us as idea. We then act not out of duty or blind instinct, but out of love for the object toward which our action is directed. The object, when we conceive of it, evokes within us the desire to act in accordance with its nature. This, and only this, is a free deed. If there were another motive beyond interest in the object, we would not act only for the sake of the action, but to achieve something else. The action would be something that we really did not want. It would be an action against our own will. This is true when we act egoistically. Then we are uninterested in the action itself, but feel the need for what it brings us. But we then feel a sense of compulsion, because to achieve the desired benefit, we must perform the action. We feel no need for the action itself, and would not do it if no benefit followed. However, an action not performed for its own sake is not a free deed. Egoistic actions are not free. We act unfreely when we act for any reason other than the objective content of the action itself. When we perform a deed for its own sake, we act out of love. Only when guided by the love of our action, by devotion to the objective world, are we truly free. If we are incapable of such selfless devotion, we will never experience freedom in our actions. If human activity is to be nothing other than the realization of our own ideas, then those ideas must, of course, exist within us. We must be inwardly productive. After all, what else could fill us with motivation except an idea taking shape in our mind? The clearer, the more sharply delineated the idea appears to us, the more fruitful it will be. We are powerfully driven toward realizing those actions as an idea. Vaguely conceived, indefinite ideals are unsuitable motives for action. How can they fire our enthusiasm if they are not vivid and clear? The motives for our actions must therefore always arise as individual intentions. Everything fruitful that human beings do originates in individual impulses. Universal, in quotes, moral laws and ethical norms applied to all are completely worthless. If morality, according to Kant, consists only of what everyone can accept as the law, then our response must be that if everyone were to do only what is suitable for all, positive action would have to cease and greatness disappear. No, action should not be guided by vague general ethical norms, but by the most individual ideals. There is nothing that everyone can aspire toward. Aspirations vary from person to person, depending on the calling of each. In his essay titled Ethical Freedom in Kant, Berlin 1882, J. Krahenbuhl has this to say, quote, "If in fact freedom is to be my freedom, if a moral action is to be mine, and if goodness and justice are to be realized through me, through the actions of this particular individual, then I cannot possibly be satisfied with a general law that disregards all individuality and specificity of the concurrent circumstances and demands that I test every action ahead of time as to whether its guiding motive conforms to an abstract norm of universal human nature, and whether, as it lives and works within me, it could become a general standard of behavior. Adapting to what is commonly acceptable in this way would render impossible any individual freedom, any progress beyond any progress beyond the ordinary and parochial, and any significant, outstanding, and groundbreaking ethical achievement." Close quote. This illuminates the questions that any system of ethics must answer. They are usually addressed as though ethics were a collection of norms for the guidance of human actions. From this point of view, ethics is placed in opposition to the natural sciences, indeed to all science that deals with reality. Whereas science endeavors to demonstrate the laws of existence, ethics is supposed to teach us the laws of what should be. Ethics is expected to be a code that encompasses all human ideals, a detailed answer to the question, what is good? That kind of science is impossible. There can be no universal answer to this question. Ethical activity is a product of what arises in each individual. It always arises in a particular case, never in general. There are no universal laws about what one should or should not do. One should never view the laws of various nations in this way. They too are no more than the expression of individual intentions. What one person perceived as moral was transferred to a whole nation to become the, quote, law of the land, close quote. A universal, natural law, intended to be valid for all people at all times, is a monstrosity. Legal philosophies and concepts of morality come and go with nations, even with individuals. Eventually, it is always the individual that decides. Consequently, it is not feasible to speak of ethics in this way. There are other questions, however, that a science of ethics can answer, ones that have been mentioned in passing, specifically those that concern the difference between human activity and natural events, the nature of will and freedom, and so on. All these questions can be summed up in one. To what extent are human beings intrinsically ethical? This is simply a question about insight into the moral nature of the human being. The question is not, what should a human being do? It is rather, what is it that human beings do when they follow their inner nature? The wall is thus removed that separates all science into two separate spheres, a science of all that is and a science of what should be. Like all sciences, ethics is a science of what is. In this sense, there is something that is common to all the sciences. They proceed from a given and progress to the conditions that determine it. But there cannot be a science of human activity, because such activity is indeterminate, productive, and creative. Jurisprudence is not a science, but a collection of memoranda about the legal habits proper to one nation's individuality. As individuals, human beings belong not only to themselves, but also to two greater wholes. First, as members of a nation, individuals are united by social mores and have in common a culture, a language, and shared views. But as individuals, we are also citizens of history and participate in the great process of human evolution. This dual allegiance to greater wholes seems to restrict our free human activity. Our actions do not seem to be only the product of an individual, but seem conditioned by what we have in common with our nation. Our individuality seems to be annihilated by the national character. Am I free, then, if it is possible to explain my actions, not only as an expression of my individual nature, but also largely as an expression of my nationality? Do I act a certain way because nature happened to make me a member of this particular national community? The same is true of my place in human history. As a child of my time, I am dependent on the cultural era into which I was born. But if we view ourselves as beings of both knowledge and action, the contradiction resolves itself. The capacity for knowledge allows us to penetrate the character of our national identity and see where our fellow citizens are headed. The very factors that seem to determine us are those we must transcend and take into ourselves with full awareness. Thus they become individual in us and acquire the personal character of free actions. The same is true of the historical evolution within which I take my place. I gain insight into the governing ideas and moral forces of my time, and once I do so, they no longer determine me, but become individual motives. We need to actively penetrate our time and culture, so that we will not be led, but lead ourselves. We must not allow ourselves to be led blindly by our national character. We must instead come to understand it so that we can work consciously in the spirit of our nation. We cannot allow ourselves to be carried along by cultural progress. Rather, we must appropriate the ideas of our time. This requires us, first of all, to understand the culture in which we live. Then, in freedom, we will assume the tasks of our time and apply our efforts in the appropriate context. This is where we need the humanities, parenthesis, history, cultural and literary history, and so on, close parenthesis. In the humanities, we look at human achievements, the accomplishments of culture, literature, the arts, and so on. Here, the spirit takes hold of spiritual matters. The purpose of the humanities must be to allow us to recognize where chance placed us as individuals. We must recognize what has been achieved and what we need to accomplish. The humanities help us to find the right place to participate in the world's work. We must know the cultural world and determine our contribution accordingly. In the first volume of his title, Images of the German Past, Leipzig, 1859, Gustav Freytag says, quote, "All great creations of national powers, traditional religions, mores, laws, and government, can no longer be seen as the achievement of individual human beings. They are organic creations of a higher life, which at any given time can become visible only through individuals, and which at any given time unifies individual spirits into a powerful whole. Thus, without being mystical about it, one can speak of a folk soul. Unlike the will of an individual, however, the life of a nation does not work consciously. What is free and rational in history is represented by individuals. The national force works untiringly with the dark compulsion of a primal force." Close quote. If Freytag had investigated the life of nations, he might have found that it resolves itself into the sum of the actions of its individuals. They overcome this dark compulsion by raising what is unconscious into their consciousness. He would have seen how the very thing he calls the folk soul, and describes as a dark compulsion, proceeds from individual impulses of the will, from the free actions of human beings. We must, however, consider yet another aspect of the work of individual human beings within a nation. Each person represents a spiritual potential, a sum of forces, looking for a possibility to unfold its activity. Consequently, as individuals, we must each find the place where our work can be incorporated meaningfully into the national organism. Whether we find our place cannot be left to chance. The purpose of a state's constitution is to ensure that each person finds a suitable sphere of action. The state is the form in which the national organism lives. The task of anthropology and political science is to discover how people can realize their potential as individuals within the state. The Constitution must arise from the nation's innermost being. The best Constitution will express the national character in specific formulations. Political leaders cannot force a constitution upon the people. They must investigate the deepest characteristics of their nation and channel latent tendencies through an appropriate constitution. It can happen that the majority of a nation is drawn in a direction that goes against its own nature. According to Goethe, national leaders are then obligated to let themselves be guided by that nature, and not by the momentary demands of the majority. They then have to represent the deepest qualities of the nation against the nation, from Verses in Prose. We should add here a word about the method of historical research. History must always bear in mind that the causes of historical events may be found in the individual intentions, plans, and so on of individuals. It is always a mistake to interpret historical events according to underlying plans. One must always ask about the goals of certain individuals, what path they followed, and so on. History must always be based on human nature, human will, and human tendencies. We can now substantiate what has been said about ethical science with Goethe's own words. Quote, "The rational world must be considered a great immortal individual, which unceasingly does what is needed, and in this way gains mastery, even over random occurrences." From Verses in Prose. End of quote. We can understand this only in terms of the relationship between individuals and historical evolution as we have described it. By implication, Goethe refers to the positive activity of individuals in history when he says, quote, "Absolute action of any kind leads to bankruptcy. The least of us can be perfect if they act within the limits of their capacities and skills." Inner parenthesis, regarding the need to elevate oneself to the leading ideas of one's people and time, close inner parenthesis, continue quote. Let each of us ask ourselves which organ we have available and will use to work upon our time. We need to know where we ourselves stand and where the others want to go. Parenthesis, our view of duty is confirmed in, close parenthesis, duty, when one loves what one has commanded oneself to do. From Verses in Prose, close quote. We have consistently established the independence of the individual as a being of knowledge and action. We have shown how our ideas coincide with the foundations of the world, and have recognized that everything we do can emanate only from our own individuality. We seek the core of existence within the individual human being. No one can reveal a dogmatic truth to another person, and no one can force another to act. As individuals, we are rooted in ourselves. Whatever we are as individuals, we must become through our own powers, not through those of others. We must create everything out of ourselves, including the source of our own happiness. We have seen that there can be no question of a power guiding us, determining the direction and substance of our existence, and condemning us to dependency. If I am to find happiness, I am the only one who can bring it about. An external power cannot prescribe the norms of my actions. Likewise, such a power cannot endow things with the capacity to awaken a feeling of contentment in me. I must do it myself. Pleasure and displeasure are present for me only when I have first attributed to objects the power to awaken those feelings in myself. A creator that would determine externally what gives us pleasure and what gives us none would be leading us about on a leash. All optimism and pessimism are thus refuted. The optimist assumes that the world is perfect, that it must be the source of the greatest satisfaction for a person. If I assumed this were true, I would first have to develop in myself the needs to be fulfilled and thus satisfied. I would have to gain what I demand from objects of the world. The pessimist, on the other hand, believes that the world is such that it always leaves us dissatisfied, that happiness is impossible. What pitiable creatures human beings would be if nature were to grant us happiness from outside. All complaining about an existence that fails to satisfy us, or a world that is hard, must end when we consider the fact that no power on earth can give us pleasure unless we first lend it the magic ability to lift us and make us happy. Happiness must arise for us from what we ourselves make of things, from our own creations. Only this is worthy of free beings. The end of chapter 10.